Every small town has its own set of local legends. They rarely extend beyond the town's limits and almost never make it online, which is ironic, considering I'm writing this now, but the locals know them by heart. I've heard a lot of these tales in my years as a truck driver, but none of them ever seem to hold any truth, except for one. The story of the specter. I heard it while traveling through Wyoming. I had stopped for the night, as I was utterly exhausted, and the humidity had caused my windshield to fog up. I ended up in a tiny town called Glenwood, about an hour from Riverton and 3 hours from where I needed to deliver my load. When I say it was tiny, I mean it. There were maybe 15 buildings in total, most of them houses. The rest were a single diner with a bar attached, a church, and a gas station. I wasn't too sure about the diner's quality, but I was starving, so I decided to at least sit at the bar and order something if they had it. The door jingled as I walked in, and a mostly empty dining area greeted me. There were 3 people in the building from what I could see. The bartender was a burly man with a scruffy beard who gave me a curious look as soon as I walked in. The only other person at the bar was a young woman, drinking a beer with no label, who didn't even glance at me when I took a seat. I clearly didn't belong here, and it felt that way. Still, I picked up a menu and tapped the beer I wanted. When I took my first sip, she finally spoke. "I haven't seen you around here before." Her voice was a mix of gruff and soothing. I was startled but maintained my politeness and turned to face her, trying to make small talk. "I'm not from around here. Just passing through." I figured. "What brings you to this neck of the woods?" "The appetite of a damn horse. I've been driving for 11 hours. She chuckled. She wasn't unattractive, but not my type either, so I hoped she wouldn't misinterpret my jokes as flirting. "You've got a good sense of humor." I turned away for a moment to signal for another beer, then looked back at her. "I try." She glanced at the bartender as he passed me my second drink and waited for him to take my order before signaling him. "Jack, should we do it?" He grunted and walked into the kitchen. She seemed to take that as a yes and looked back at me with a hint of excitement. "We have a tradition here. Everyone who drinks at the bar has to share a story. It's nothing too crazy, but with only 20 people living here, we're always eager to hear something new. I'm not a very interesting person, despite my travels. You'd think I'd have some wild stories, but I've mostly just stayed on the road. Still, I wanted to entertain them, so I told them a story about the first time I saw the ocean. As I munched on some fries, I tried to make it sound as fantastic as possible, adding a few details for flair. I'd never actually seen a killer whale, but they didn't need to know that. The woman seemed captivated by the story, her chin resting in her hands, her eyes locked on mine. When I finished my tale and turned back to the bar, placing a tip on the counter, I was about to say goodbye when the woman stopped me with a smirk. "You've got a nice voice. Thanks for sharing your story. I've got one to tell you too." I was exhausted, but my manners prevented me from refusing. I smiled and gestured for her to continue. "It's the same story I tell everyone who comes through here, because it's the one that sticks with you the longest." I nearly jumped when the bartender spoke up suddenly. It wasn't even directed at me, but it startled me. "The specter story again?" "Yes, sir, unless you have a better idea." He stayed silent. She looked at me and began her tale. The specter was a local ghost story about something that haunted travelers who passed through town. It was a tall, pale figure that would only speak one word at a time. It would start haunting someone once they heard its story and wouldn't stop until they were dead. I listened, entertained, as she described how the specter would make people vanish, but I wasn't buying it. "But how can you tell if the specter is after you?" "It makes you see things, man. Things that aren't real, but you'll feel like they are." To me, it sounded like a bad trip or just a tactic to keep me in town. I was blinking in and out of consciousness by the time she finished, and decided to head back to my motel before her storytelling went on any longer. "Well, I'm heading out. Have a good one." She stopped smiling and stared at me blankly. I got up and walked towards the door, pushing it open with my foot. "Hey, one question before you go." I sighed and turned around. "I just wanted to get some rest." "Yeah, what's up?" "You can see me, right?" I wasn't sure if I'd heard her correctly, but it was a weird question. Who was US? Her and the bartender? Of course I could see them. They were right there. She was starting to creep me out. Yeah? She took a sip of her drink and looked at the bartender before turning back to me. Well, good night. My brow furrowed as I walked out the door. Whatever was going on with her, I wanted no part of it. She'd been nice up until then. I had no idea where that sudden change came from. I wasn't in the mood to ponder it further, so I walked down the street towards the motel. I thought about her story as I walked. Why was that the story she told people passing through town? Some kind of scare tactic, maybe? I wasn't sure. I unlocked my room door, brushed my teeth, and went to bed. I woke up to a knock at the door. I rubbed my eyes and groaned. I hadn't slept well at all. I grabbed my phone off the bedside table, squinting at the bright screen. It was 3 a.m. What could someone want at this hour? I wasn't about to answer it. I put my phone back and shut my eyes, hoping whoever it was would just leave. The second knock was louder, like someone had slapped their hand on the door. I jumped out of bed and crouched on the floor, pressing my back against the door to keep it shut. The pounding continued, and I didn't have faith that the flimsy motel door would hold. I crawled on my hands and knees to the door and leaned against it. The pounding suddenly stopped. I was terrified that the door would give way or that someone would try the handle, but neither happened. Instead, I heard shuffling and then a whisper through the silence. Open. It was no louder than a breath, but in the dead quiet, I heard it clearly. My heart sank as I tried to process what I just heard. It didn't sound like anyone I knew, but it didn't really sound like a man or a woman. I stayed as still as possible, holding my breath. Please, open. Each whisper sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Whoever was outside was either genuinely in need of help or trying to trick me into opening the door so they could do God knows what. I had to stay put. If I went for my phone, I was afraid the door would burst open and I'd be face to face with whoever it was. I sat there for what felt like ages. Just as I was starting to fall asleep again, I heard footsteps moving away from the door. I slowly moved away from the door and was almost at the bedside table when I noticed the bathroom door, which had been open before, was now closed. I froze, unsure of what to do. When the pounding started again from the bathroom door, I jumped up, grabbed my phone and keys, and sprinted for the front door. As I flung it open, I heard heavy footsteps behind me and the same voice. No. It kept repeating calmly, following me. I raced down the stairs, through the parking lot, and jumped into my truck. As I got in, I felt something hit the door. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to look, but I did. Standing outside my door was a grotesque face. Its eyes were like baseballs, wide open and staring directly at me. Its mouth was gaping, as if the jaw couldn't close. It had no nose or ears, or any other features. We stared at each other for what felt like forever. Without moving its gaping mouth, it spoke. See, me. By now, I understood what was happening and quickly started the truck. I drove away as fast as I could, not stopping until the town was just a faint light in the distance. Exhausted, I could barely keep my eyes open. I yawned and slapped myself to stay awake, but there was an added sense of dread in my stomach. I cautiously turned my head to the left. It was still there. Its head was right up against my window, smiling at me. I fought the urge to scream and kept my eyes on the road. It couldn't get in or affect me if I didn't look at it, but it could talk. Its low, haunting voice, interspersed with guttural growls, echoed. You. See. Me. It kept repeating that for hours. By the time dawn arrived, I'd almost forgotten what silence was. As the light filled my eyes, it finally went silent, and the only sound was the tires on the bumpy road. I glanced left and saw only trees now. I arrived in Dupree shortly after and didn't even help the factory workers unload. I just sat in the driver's seat, smoking a cigarette and reflecting on what had happened. When someone knocked on my window, I nearly had a heart attack. It was the factory supervisor who I'd called to sign off on the delivery. You all right? Some of my guys said you didn't look so hot. I cleared my throat and put out the cigarette. I managed to smile. Yeah, I'm fine. Just a rough night. Had to leave at 3 a.m. 3 a.m.? How far away were you that you just got here now? I opened the door and stepped out, holding my clipboard. It felt good to make small talk after everything I'd been through. I was in Glenwood. Odd little place. Glenwood? Never heard of it. I looked at him, expecting him to be joking. His face was serious, though, and he seemed concerned. I pulled out my phone and showed him the delivery tracking app, which showed where I had stopped for the night. "It's right here." He glanced at my phone and then at me, his concern deepening. "I've been out there hunting. There's nothing but woods for miles.